Turning it over to AT and John, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, JC. And hopefully everybody enjoyed the quick network breakout, get to meet some new folks and learn what people are working on. And, we're excited to have John King join us today. Got a great background, started in the military, been involved in multiple different healthcare startups. So lots of good stories, hopefully, to share there. So John, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, AT. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no, so it should be fun. So what we'll probably do today is a little bit into John's background and how he got into healthcare and some of his roles. And then we'll move into some of his experiences having run, organizations and what that means in terms of culture and aligning the team and some of the lessons learned across different companies. And then we'll wrap with a couple questions just around Atlanta and the future of healthcare and things like that. So one thing for the audience, as we're going, we will do Q&A at the end. So as you think of something, feel free to put it in the chat. And then at the end, JC will help us read a few of those questions to ask John. So, well, great. Well, with that, let's jump in. And John, maybe to start with, how did you even get into healthcare in the first place? What was exciting about healthcare, or how did you stumble into that?
Yeah, I stumble into it is probably the right descriptor. I was really fortunate. After a stint in the Army, I moved back to the Philadelphia area, back home, and I was fortunate that my father had been in the HIT space and arranged some interviews. And through those interviews, I ended up working with a company called Shared Medical Systems, which was one of the pioneers of the HIT industry, remote computing. So that's how I got into it, which is not that inspiring or interesting. I think perhaps the bigger reason is why have I stayed in healthcare for 30 years now? Mm-hmm. And what I love about the healthcare industry is that I quickly realized that this just wasn't a job, but this was 30 years ago, HIT was an emerging growth industry. It still is a growth industry. And it's one that has a meaningful purpose, and it's mission driven. It's focused on solving problems that matter. And over the past 3 decades, as I've gotten older and had a family and my parents got older, you really develop an ongoing and just deep appreciation of the problems in healthcare and the opportunity to fix problems that matter to everyone. So that's what I love about this industry. That's why I've stayed in it.
Yeah, and I think it's so cool, right? Obviously, healthcare, everybody's got stories of experiencing that and seeing that it does have an impact, beyond just the dollars and cents. But also love about healthcare is we're all consumers as well. We've all experienced it firsthand and have seen many of the problems just as a consumer. So it gives you a lot of extra incentive to go try and solve things. So maybe let's talk a little bit, John, about some of your stops, along the way, having worked with, Standard Register and MedAssets, McKesson, and then we'll sort of wrap talking about OmniSYS and what you did there. But tell us about that journey a little bit of, how you got involved in some of those and some of the roles you took.
Sure. Yeah. As you can imagine, my career sort of is an outline of the evolution of the HIT industry. I started, my first job working for Shared Medical Systems was pulling Ethernet cables and helping hospitals implement Ethernet-based local area networks. I mean, this was a time when everybody wore suits and ties, and I was crawling around underneath the raised floors of IT departments. There's probably a lot of people on the call that don't even remember the fact that we used to have raised floors on where your computers were stored. And I was hired out as a night operator where I drive around to hospitals and facilitate the backup of their systems. And that was like old tape to tape backups. So that's perhaps dates me in terms of like my entry point into healthcare. But what ended up happening is my early on career, I had a series of jobs as an individual contributor, installing software, supporting software, marketing, and then sales. The companies I worked for started in the inpatient setting. We focused on automating transactional workflow. It started with revenue cycle, then it moved into clinical ancillary departments like lab, radiology, pharmacy, emergency departments. And then the career, as that automation of the inpatient environment happened, then it was moving into the ambulatory environment. So then I worked for companies that focused on physician practices, practice management systems, the very early first generation of clinical documentation and EMR solutions for the ambulatory practices. Then I came back into the inpatient setting where I focused on electronic health records, computerized physician order entry, and then over the last several years, the industry and my career has pulled me into alternate settings and focus on other issues that deal with less around transactional automation, but how do we utilize data to support or enhance workflow? At Standard Register, the focus was helping a very old company that was really focused on print documentation, but helping them organize their assets around a healthcare business, and then begin to transition towards what was a print documentation business and move it towards more of a patient-centric care communication company that had that was increasingly focused on automating workflow and content management through software. And in the last 7 years, it brings me to my most recent work, which was a company called OmniSYS. And OmniSYS is a really great company, really cool company that's focused on addressing the issues of access, improving access to care, specifically access to convenient quality care. And in the retail pharmacy, that's the strategic setting of care that OmniSYS focuses on. And our thesis at OmniSYS was based on the fact that due to the growth of a senior population, and so the demographic changes and all of the health-related issues associated with it, that more and more people would be seeking out healthcare in the pharmacy, and that the pharmacist would continue to expand their role as a medical provider of basic and preventative care services. We call that the pharmacist as a provider thesis. And so at OmniSYS, what we focused on was building out a platform of solutions that would help enable the pharmacist and the pharmacy to grow their clinical services. Things like immunizations, point of care testing, health screenings, health counseling, diabetes counseling, heart health, things of that nature. So our portfolio of products centered around patient communication, how we help pharmacies extend their relationships with their patients beyond the four walls of the pharmacy, electronic health record, so that we could actually enable a clinical encounter in the pharmacy. And then lastly, all that was built on a foundation of revenue cycles so that we would help them be able to process medical claims and get reimbursed for those services. Today, OmniSYS serves over half the pharmacies in the country, have one or more OmniSYS products. And in fact, if anybody on this call has gone to a pharmacy for an immunization in the past several years, there is a high probability that OmniSYS supported that encounter. Everything from processing that claim, identifying any gaps in your immunization history, and then reporting all of those immunization results back to state and federal reporting agencies.
Very cool. Well, a lot of neat stuff in there, John, that we can dig into around, just your background in sales. I always find that fascinating. So I want to touch on that a little bit. And I loved how you talked about some of the evolutions of healthcare over the time around changing care settings. I want to jump into that in a little bit,
Okay.
As well as just the broader trend of just getting data to now applying data and getting into workflow. So we'll touch on those here as we go forward, but maybe let's just start on the sales side. I always find it interesting that, folks who've been successful like yourself often have come in with a sales background. And so, first question there is, what did you learn in sales that was helpful to you in your career as you continue to move up to run companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So the background in sales is really critical. One of the things I was thinking about is, what are the experiences that prepared me to be a CEO over time? And, I can point back to certain things in my career, like, I think the Army was great for teaching and leadership principles. All of those jobs I had as an individual contributor, installs, support, marketing, those were all really insightful and learning, because you start to learn different business functions, and you sort of get a viewpoint of how those functions all operate individually, and then how they have to work together in concert to make a successful company. But I would say that the most single impactful thing that prepared me to be CEO were sales and account management, the things that brought you directly into contact with the customer. You know, at the end of the day, understanding your customer and learning how to manage and deliver on their expectations, that's everything, right? And so as a CEO of a technology business, your job is to grow the company. And the only way you're going to do that is ultimately by understanding the needs of your customers, and that in sales, that, you know, that ultimately, if you're going to be really good at sales, it starts with really understanding the customer intimately. And so I look back, it's probably the most important aspect of my my preparation as CEO.
I love that, and I think, you know, it's interesting, we see that, right, those startup CEOs who have that bent to be out in front of the customer, you just get so much better feedback on the product, what it takes to actually close the deal, versus I'm building some great tech in the lab, and then I try and pop out of the lab and say, here it is, will you buy it? I see far more success when you're out in front of the customer. So I love that you said that.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. I think that, you know, one of the other things that we talked about in preparation for this meeting was just like the aspect of culture. And I think a derivative of, well, it's not necessary. It's certainly not necessary to be a successful startup or entrepreneur if you don't have a sales background. But I do think from a culture standpoint, those startups that are really successful have cultures that place the customer at the center, and they, you know, they develop a culture around the passion of serving, understanding the customer's needs and serving the customer. So even if it's not a sales background, I think to be successful, you have to have a true passion for the client.
So to that point, to that point, John, like, give us some more examples of that. Like, how did that manifest itself as you were building the culture at OmniSYS and encouraging your team to get out in front of customers? Are there certain things you did in that process that you would share sort of as some things that you found were helpful and successful?
Yeah, you know, well, one, I think culture is critical, right? It's, I think it's paramount for a startup, right? Because culture is going to be the thing that allows you to overcome perhaps many issues around talent acquisition or retention. You may not be able to always pay or provide the same level of benefits, but if you have a really strong culture, I think that becomes a key ingredient to success. In terms of establishing culture and some things that I think have been important is, one, developing a really clear and meaningful mission and vision statements become really important. You know, the mission, establishing a mission that matters, or like the why are you in this business? That's important. It allows people to gravitate and around a central idea, and ultimately becomes a backbone, I think, for culture to grow. Establishing a really clear vision of what and how you're going to achieve that mission is also really important. And so if you have that mission and vision established with clarity, and then those things need to be reiterated and reinforced constantly throughout the business. And as I said, I think that is the backbone that allows you to scale, because at the end of the day, as your business evolves, if the mission and vision are correct, everything just continues to build around those central ideas. Scaling a team around culture is an interesting question. You know, I have not been I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm more of my experience is the guy who comes in typically in working with founder-led companies. I'm the guy who comes in next to help scale. But one of the things that I think becomes really important is as you're running a startup, I think one of the strengths and things I love about startup companies is that what's common is around passion for an idea. There's great subject matter expertise that many founders and entrepreneurs bring to a business. there's also agility that startups have. And those are all the really positive attributes that make startups fun to work with. But as you scale, you've got to really start to focus then on multiple culture and operations. How do you begin to disseminate these ideas, right? How do you begin to transfer knowledge into other people so that you can build out a stronger operational layer, so that you don't become such a one or two key people that have all of the knowledge in the business and then doers, individual contributors, but you need to develop that operational layer, which also is the catalyst for continuing to drive and reinforce culture throughout a business.
And so on that, John, yeah, how that's a difficult transition for a lot of companies, right? Going from the founder-led leader to somebody else coming in to help start to scale it up and put more process. And I've always found there's a balancing act, a little bit of attention to some degree, right? Because, hey, this is the way we've always done it and we were successful, and we don't need process to scale up and grow. We do need some process in communicating. So how did you manage or work through some of those challenges?
Yeah, so that's a really good observation and interesting question. Over the course of my career, so I've acquired, like, for example, at OmniSYS, we acquired 3 founder-led businesses to help build out our portfolio and our platform. And I would say that of those acquisitions, I think 2 were home runs and 1 was not. 1 was a sliding single. Maybe I'd describe it that way. But here's some things that I think were common needs. One, what was true about all of them were the things I mentioned before. All 3 companies had founders that had clear passion for their idea. They had great levels of subject matter expertise in their business, and they were agile in terms of their ability to deliver on a product idea. What made the 2 that were really successful is that the founders were also highly self-aware and had real clarity around what they were strong at and what they weren't. And they were looking to exit for the right reasons. And I think what's interesting is that they recognized across all 3 is that the deficiency around sales. And so maybe one of the things we could talk about is like go to market and sales approach, but they all recognized that they had achieved they had grown the business as far as they could, and they didn't know how to scale specifically sales. So that was an area that needed further investment. Those that were also successful had begun the process when we acquired them of successfully replicating and transferring knowledge beyond their own headspace, right? They had developed a handful of key operational leaders, and that was critical, right? Because then as a larger organization, we were able to continue to build upon that and then find places where we were able to ingest those people into our business, helping grow their careers, but also continue to scale the business. The one that was not successful was missing exactly those. It was a highly concentrated business where the IP was way too centralized in 2 people, and had not built out the infrastructure, and they didn't recognize that as a reason to sell. They were looking really just purely from a financial exit, and so
yeah,
maybe some of the key lessons there.
No, cool, interesting there. And you mentioned sales go-to-market process. I want to jump on that in a minute, but just one last question on sort of the M&A side. Having done several of these and seeing, one of the things startups oftentimes say, hey, I want to go get acquired by company X, or I want to be acquired by, what are some lessons learned or you could share with startup? You touched on some of the operationals, what makes those successful acquisitions, but how do startups even get on your radar? Or is it not up to them? You're going to find them. Like, what are things they can do to get on the radar or make themselves more attractive as an acquisition candidate?
Yeah, that's great. Well, so how did we find these companies? One, we worked with a a banker who specializes in healthcare. It's a group called HGP, or Healthcare Growth Partners, was the name of the firm that we used. And they focused on founder-led businesses of a certain financial profile that aligned with identifying more startup companies that had achieved a certain level of revenue growth, and that were our profile. We were looking for people that had achieved positive EBITDA, and could be break even to having achieved positive EBITDA growth. But that was really helpful, and they brought to us, I mean, I think over the course of the 7 years at OmniSYS, we probably spoke to close to 200 different companies that we sort of went through at some level of due diligence. The other area where we identified acquisition opportunities was through the industry itself. So working in the different trade shows, and in the case of OmniSYS, that was a focus on the pharmacy, like National Association of Drugstore chains, going to large companies like McKesson that have large user group meetings where their channel partners would come to. And some of those channel partners that were identified as acquisition targets was a really good ground for us to identify.
So on that partner question there, I think there's differing viewpoints on this, but curious your take is, there's one mindset that says, hey, go partner with a potential acquirer, see that you both enjoy working together, and that can lead to acquisition. And then there's another school of thought that says that's just a waste of time, partnering with a larger company. And any takes on partnerships and how valuable those are?
Well, I would say if we think about like the go-to-market and sales strategies for startups, the two things that through my personal experience in all of the startups that I've worked with, what I've seen to be common is that they grew their businesses because they identified, some early adopters, key clients, and number one, they were really good at reference selling. They were able to take that key relationship, had a very highly customer-centric culture, took care of those key customers, and then those customers helped them reference to other clients. So reference selling, I think, is really critical for startups because that creates the nucleus of your reference sites and the foundation of the customer base. But the other area, virtually in every business that I've worked with, was through partnerships, successful partnerships, where they identified larger companies in the market, and whether those were reference agreements or perhaps they were even closer reselling type relationships, but through key strategic channel partners is how they were able to grow their business. The key deficiency virtually in all of the startups that I've worked with has been, they have very limited limited scalable sales forces. So that's something that as an acquirer, one of the first areas we were able to really help lean in on was to take a product and plug it into a scalable enterprise level sales force and then help drive that next phase of growth for those companies. But I think channel partners are critical.
Maybe talk a little more about that, John. I think that's, the importance of sales and go-to-market process, but specifically in a place like healthcare, where you've got many different constituents and you may have regulations and all sorts of other things. It's even more complex than just a traditional B2B sales organization. How does that differ in healthcare, and what should startups think about there?
Yeah, well, I think that's something that many startups, and quite frankly, there's a long list of large Fortune 500 companies that have tried to break into healthcare and have not been successful. And you sort of begs why, and it goes to exactly the points you're making. This is a highly regulated industry. It's complex. There are a lot of constituents. There are a lot of interdependencies that people need to understand if you're going to be successful in healthcare. And for startups, I'm not having run a startup, I was thinking about how would you go about solving these issues? Because quite frankly, these are still issues for large companies to deal with as you're bringing in new products to market. You certainly can do that through consultants, can help in that regard. developing a really good network through organizations like Atlanta Ventures, where you can identify other people that have expertise in the different areas of healthcare is key. And then I think one of the really important things would be for organizations to build out a board. And as you're building out a board, ensure that you have board members that have a diversity of experience within healthcare. So, having people on your board that might have payer experience or, employer benefit experience and provider experience, I think would become a really key asset for any type of startup organization.
Very cool. Well, let's transition a little bit. We got maybe 10 minutes left, and then we'll do some Q&A. So as folks have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But let's go back to one of the things you said at the beginning, which I think was fascinating, just some of the evolution of healthcare, right? You talked about different care settings, data moving just from just getting data to actually using data to put it in your workflow. Maybe I'll start with the care settings. How have you seen that evolved, and where is that going to continue to go over the coming years?
Yeah, so when I think about the trends impacting healthcare and where this is going, to me, some of the areas that remain really attractive are, number one, you have to focus on demographics and the reality that the aging of America and the growth of our senior population is going to continue to put huge strains on our healthcare system. And as a result of that, I think the alternate settings of care remains a really exciting or attractive market. With OmniSYS, we really successful. And as I've exited that business, I've exited just as sort of our provider thesis really is beginning to take off. But you're going to see, particularly in this next, the upcoming immunization season here, cold flu season, is you're going to see more and more pharmacies really begin to take on that role as a medical provider and start to do low acuity encounters. You're seeing organizations like CVS, Amazon is getting into it. The organizations, traditional retail pharmacies or retailers, are all leaning into alternate settings of care. And they're doing that because the traditional medical providers are overwhelmed. I think everybody on this call, if you've tried to go see your primary care doc, it's not easy getting in to see a doctor these days. So I think there's a tremendous amount of encounter volumes that are going to be absorbed in these alternate settings. So areas that I think are exciting would be pharmacy, home health, rehab, I think are all key. I think solutions that can solve staffing issues associated with volume are really, really cool. I think what Mike Burke's doing is a great example of exactly that, right? He's developing a technology that's not automating workflow per se, but he's using AI type capabilities to extract data or insight and identify underutilized resources, in this case in the OR setting. But that becomes really critical, right? With all of these staffing pressures and access issues, anything you can do to automate or absorb or extract more time from the system becomes really critical. I think downward reimbursement pressure is going to continue as we have this growth of our senior population. So any type of solutions that can help value-based entities better align incentives across payers, employers, and providers become really interesting. Anything that can support value-based contracting, outcomes management, really attractive. And then consumer empowerment, I think, is for me an area of just tremendous potential and excitement. And what I mean by that is, healthcare remains way too complex for an individual. It remains highly siloed. I think it's going to remain highly siloed. So putting the patient truly at the center, and how do we empower them to better navigate in an empowered way throughout the healthcare system? So care navigation, I think issues of pricing transparency. I could go on a personal basis.
So no shortage of opportunities for entrepreneurs looking to solve problems in healthcare is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, there is no shortage, but I think these issues stemming from, I would step back and really look at, there is a growing inequity between the demand for healthcare services and supply. So addressing this access and resolving is things that can help ameliorate or mitigate the issue between the inequity of demand and supply, become important, attractive market opportunities.
Yeah. Well, cool. Two last questions. I know some are coming in the chat, so we'll switch over to those in a minute. But, you also mentioned just the evolution of data and then analytics and then getting into the workflow. You mentioned like what Mike's doing. How do you see data and analytics and workflows continuing to evolve as a part of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, we've gone through as an industry the past several decades, intense processes of automating workflow, just like transactional workflow automation. And, while some of that can be reworked and improved upon, the reality is we have automated the workflow, we've digitized it, and in doing so, we've just created a tremendous amount of data. But how do we take that data and make it actionable becomes really important. So I think one of the key things, areas of opportunity, we focus on interoperability becomes really critical. I personally really attracted towards SaaS-based platforms that are service-based architecture, so that from the outset, with a recognition that you're going to have to be able to interoperate with other systems, becomes really, I think, critical. And then the evolution of certain machine learning and AI capabilities really is beginning to open up a whole new world of being able to lift data, in a more precise way, so that that information can be extracted and then through interoperability positioned into workflow to enhance a patient experience or enhance a clinical decision-making process. And that's tremendously exciting going forward.
Well, I think the workflow thing I really like because I've seen a lot of data analytics businesses, and the ones where that data or analytic layer sits outside the workflow tends to be higher churn. It's hard to sell and keep it sticky, versus when that gets into the workflow, it's super sticky and it's not coming out. So
you're absolutely right. Analytic businesses have been really it's hard to justify a ROI for analytics if it sits outside of the workflow. But if you can develop solutions that can intelligently extract data, the right data, and then put it in front of the right constituent at the right point in time in workflow, that creates tremendous value.
Yeah.
It's actually one of the really big growth drivers of OmniSYS. I'll just real quick aside, if I have just 2 minutes,
go for it.
Area of real pride for me, because go back to making an impact. Oftentimes growing up, my children, like, what do you do, Dad? And you try to explain HealthIT and people, their eyes glaze over. But at OmniSYS, you could break it down to like making a really meaningful impact, black and white. In pharmacies, 7 years ago, 30% of Americans got a flu shot at a pharmacy, but only 4% of those patients that got a flu shot were getting a pneumococcal shot. So seniors. And pneumonia is a terrible disease for somebody over 65. So what OmniSYS identified is that we were sitting on a wealth of claim data of years of having processed immunizations for pharmacies. We were able to build out a network and a platform so that we could create an informed view of identifying gaps in a patient's immunization history. And so the first thing we focused on was identifying gaps in pneumococcal for seniors. We deployed a solution that would extract in the middle of workflow. As a patient came in for a flu shot, we were able to bounce back to our system, identify patients that had no history of having received their immunizations for pneumococcal, and then present back into workflow that information to the pharmacist. The pharmacist then was able to take action. Today, over 27% of those flu shot patients now walk out with we call it a companion vaccine for pneumococcal. So a tremendous success. I mean, we have helped successfully immunize millions of seniors through that type of workflow enhancement.
Awesome. Great story there, John. Well, cool. I know we got a few minutes left. There's a couple of questions in the chat. So let me transition over to a couple of those. And if others have questions, feel free to post them there. Question, John, for you from Mike. Do you see any meaningful change in the way we pay for healthcare in the US in the next 5 to 10 years, assuming efforts at value-based care have not had the impact we hoped?
Yes, and I believe the value-based care has been slow in coming, but I do believe that we're seeing more and more movement. So Mike, one of the things that I've noticed through my work at OmniSYS and working with commercial payers is the retailers, in this case, the pharmacies, are taking action now. They're beginning to take action and develop the relationships with commercial payers around value-based care contracting, whether that's doing payment around targeted interventions and population health initiatives. So, well, I think you're correct. We haven't seen a lot of progress. I am hopeful that value-based care is coming and that we're going to see more and more progress made in that regard.
Cool. Question from Irene. John, how do you recommend health tech startups go about the process of getting to know their customer well enough to really be able to serve them?
Well, you got to be out in front. I think you have to get out in front of these customers. As startups, what I have found is that those organizations that we acquired were all present in the workflow. They had the founders of the business developed subject matter expertise around this issue or surrounded themselves with key individuals who had deep experience. And then they were spending time working with their customers in the field to really have a deep appreciation of the issues of workflow, the issues of ultimately how that workflow translate back to a product UI. But they were in the field with their customers, rolling up the sleeves and solving those problems. And in doing so, also developing really deep, meaningful relationships.
And I think one thing I'll add to that, Irene, is that, let's just say you got a brand new idea and you don't have any customers or stuff yet. You got to work extra hard to get in front of some of them. And so this is where I think when John was mentioning, hey, having a board or advisors that may have some connections to help you, or going to events where you may meet some of these folks and just start striking up a conversation. And one piece of advice I've learned there is talk to any CIO or COO at a hospital or whoever. They're getting pitched ideas and products endlessly. And the minute a pitch comes, they've tuned you out. So spend your time asking about their problems and what they're working on or their thoughts on certain topics, and use that as guides to move forward, versus if you go into pitch mode, no, they're probably tuning you out right away.
That's good advice, AT. I think that's true.
All right, next question. I see Jeff. How do you see the Medicare pre-cert program impacting the startup landscape?
I don't know enough about the Medicare pre-cert program to give you a good answer on that one, so I'm gonna pass.
Likewise, yeah. So Jeff, maybe it's more clarification there, but last question I'll throw out here, John, and then we'll wrap up. You've seen lots of companies all within different angles of healthcare. You've seen the evolution of healthcare. Any other timeless lessons learned that have been true across products, across industries, or things we haven't touched on that you would sort of depart any final wisdom to the group here?
Oh, wow. That's a big question.
Or just anything we haven't touched on yet that you think you sort of leave people with?
Yeah. I think that at the end of the day, for startups, I would say that, as I mentioned, if you're going to be successful, you're going to have a lot of passion for an idea. You're going to have the subject matter expertise, and you'll have the agility to gain that initial momentum. If success equals an exit, whether that's a sale of a company or a refinancing of the company to sort of grow to that next phase, I think maintaining self-awareness becomes really important. And where I've seen really successful, again, defined around that sort of exit criteria, successful founders and startups are really self-aware, and they exit for the right reasons. And that's something that I think is really critical. Like, understand your strengths, grow to them, but also understand where the limitations are. And then when you're ready, exit for the right reasons. And if you do that, you'll be successful. Your customers will be well taken care of. Your employees will be well taken care of. And you can look back on a really successful startup venture.
Awesome. Well, we'll sort of wrap up here. And John, first, thank you so much. Lots of great lessons there. I loved how you talked about the importance of culture and building the team, and then that stay in front of a customer. I think that's number one lesson throughout all of this, that if you do that, a lot of good things can happen. And if you don't do that, no matter how good your ideas are, you're gonna be far off from the work. So love your thoughts there. So as we wrap up here, we do these type of events, every 6 to 8 weeks for healthcare. Our next one's coming up, I think on Wednesday, October 5th. We got Jason Madsen from Ascend Medical coming to speak with us. So that should be a good one. And then we've also got an Atlanta Startup Convos that's broader than just healthcare coming up on the 21st. So if either of those are interesting, feel free to join us. And then we've also got a resources page, atlanaventures.com/healthcare, where you can see these meetups, sign up for them. We list lots of Atlanta companies. Happy to list your company there. So as investors or other folks are looking to see what's going on in Atlanta, we'll list you there. And then we record and recap these as well, that you can click on those. So with that, again, thanks everybody for coming and joining today. Look forward to seeing you again. And again, John, really appreciate you taking the time today. A lot of great stuff.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.